like I want to educate people so that we can all live better lives and not have mold be this big problem that it is
Mm.
today. And whatever I can do to help, like for me as a person, I saw, just based upon the expertise I had, and I saw this problem that existed that it didn't seem like anyone was actually trying to solve.
Mm.
And the fact that, I now kind of have this voice and I'm helping people, like, to me, that's awesome.
You're listening to the Live Life Longer show with Dan Voss, where we discuss longevity, health optimization, aging well, having more energy, and living a happier, healthier life. In this week's episode, my guest is Michael Rubino, an innovative expert in mold contamination and remediation. Michael and his company, All American Restoration, have been featured in USA Today, NJBiz, Reader's Digest, New Jersey Monthly, and Digital Trends. He was also selected as a speaker for the Spring 2020 Indoor Air Quality Association meeting in Expo. Michael has spent the past 7 years involved in construction and remediating mold contamination. His focus is not just on removing cosmetic damage resulting from mold. It's on removing all traces of mold, the spores they leave behind, and the toxins produced by the mold. He's discovered that a person suffering from hypersensitivity to mold needs all three types of decontamination to regain their health. To educate those who are suffering, Michael wrote the book Mold Medic. In detail, he advises readers how to choose a mold remediation company and the exact processes that companies should be using. Enjoy the episode. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to our conversation about mold and mold remediation and the work that you're doing. So I kind of want to start off with that. I like to give our listeners kind of insight on who you are, where you came from, what got you to this spot, and what got you interested in the topic of mold and mold remediation. So maybe you can start telling us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so my father has been a contractor since I'm 5 years old, and that naturally led to this path of where I had a very strong understanding of construction, how homes are built, just kind of growing up with that. And right after college, I ended up moving back home, working for my dad. He primarily does fire restoration, so naturally fires are put out with water. Water creates mold. So you have this situation where, I started seeing mold all the time. And that was right around when Hurricane Sandy happened, which obviously devastated that area in the Northeast. And I think what really turned the page for me is probably twofold. One, in watching this fire restoration happen, you'd have insurance companies that would come in and basically kind of poo-poo the idea that, mold's a problem, throw some bleach on it, paint over it. That was kind of the antics. And naturally I was like, that doesn't seem right. We're talking about something microbiological that's alive. It's a living organism. Painting over it's probably not the right approach.
Right.
But that's kind of where the industry started from. It was not this big deal. The second thing was after Hurricane Sandy, and usually when you have like a big national natural disaster like that, people from all over the place come for this opportunity to make money. And so you had these like pop-up mold remediation companies that came in and were remediating homes. And for many, many years, I think it was like literally until the 7th year after Hurricane Sandy, I was still remediating homes that had already been quote unquote remediated.
Wow.
So I clearly saw a big disparity in the way we do things as an industry. And I saw a need for change. Then I started getting into what I consider the sensitive space, as someone who is sensitive to mold for whatever reason that may be, and trying to understand what needs to be done for a person like that. And that's a severe underserved portion of the population, which actually equates to about 1 in 4 people.
Wow.
So, and what's even more intense is I'll go into some of these clients' homes and maybe the wife is sick or the husband's sick or maybe one of the kids is sick. And usually the other family members are looking at them like, well, is this really happening? Because they don't have that same understanding. And it's hard to understand something when it's not occurring to you. It
Right.
almost seems like it's not real because I feel fine here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very, very interesting in what's kind of led to today. But, now I'm looking at things from a perspective of, well, I can't solve this problem one house at a time.
Right.
So I wrote the book, The Mold Medic, and, now my personal journey is to educate, the consumer on how mold can impact your health, how to actually get rid of it if you do have it, what things to look for, and, try to really change the process by really education.
Yeah, that's super cool. So what about somebody that thinks their illness or their sensitivity might be from mold? How can they go about detecting that? And I guess, like, what are the steps in that process?
Sure. So what's crazy about this is a lot of the homes that I go to, like, you would never know that there's mold in them. And then I'll look at the mold report and it'll be like, wow, I mean, this is off the charts.
Yeah.
And so it can be really, problematic to try to identify if is mold a problem for me. The best way to do it is to really find a thorough mold inspector. And I mean, when I say thorough, I mean, they're in your house 4 to 8 hours doing a deep dive, checking every nook and cranny and looking to see if there's any possibility where mold could be growing. Because that's the other part, is as bad as a lot of the remediators are, the same problem occurs on the inspection side, where they come in and they take one air sample in the middle of your house and they're like, oh, perfect. Air quality is less than outside, so it's got to be good. That doesn't really give you, an air test is only going to give you a snapshot in time of like what passes through the air at that exact moment. But there's so many things to consider, because if you have mold, you're going to have mold, obviously mold spores settling in the dust in the home. And so anytime those get kicked up and get into the air and get in your breathing zone, that's where that opportunity to create, those symptoms occurs. So if they do an air test real quick and in the middle of the room when everything's still, you're not really going to get a good snapshot of, is there a problem here? So I think having a good inspector is really important. And if you read my book, The Mold Medic, you'll quickly find out that years of experience on the job has nothing to do with how good you are or how thorough you are. It's really just the fundamentals in which you employ to really make sure, am I looking for every sign possible?
Sure.
And that's the key. Same thing with remediation. The first chapter of my book outlines how I was across the table from a gentleman who was in the business for 35 years. So, for me, I don't have 35 years of experience. I'm sure you can see that from looking at my face. When I sat across him and showed him everything he was doing wrong, it was like, well, I've always done things that way, and that's our mentality with our industry. It's like, well, it's always been done that way. So, guys, change is good.
Right. Is there anything, this may be an elementary question, but is there anything that we can be doing to reduce having mold in our homes?
Absolutely. So maintenance is key. We have to get out of buying homes and just letting them sit for 30 years. You have to be proactive and making sure. So here's the conditions you need. You need water or moisture or humidity.
Okay.
That's what actually allows the opportunity for mold to grow. Once the opportunity is present, mold needs a food source, right? It has to have like dust. Dust is a food source for it. Drywall, insulation. Basically, dust is always occurring in our environment. So naturally, it's going to have an unlimited food source there. But you'll see it actually grows, and it grows into building materials. It feeds off the building materials, and that's how it kind of spreads rapidly once you have it. The thing for that is you need to make sure you're maintaining the windows and doors so that there's not leaks coming in. Maintain your roof. That's huge. Your HVAC system, all your mechanicals, so like your hot water heater, you want to make sure that that's always in working order. You don't have a big leak there. Your appliances that have water connections like dishwasher, potentially the fridge, all of those things are always important to get checked out every year. I think a lot of us, it just kind of skips our mind. The other thing is the actual filtration system for HVAC is important. You have these filters you have to change all the time. If you don't have an HVAC company that comes in routinely to do that, and that's up to you to do, you got to stay on top of that, because when they get really, really clogged, they become inefficient and actually allow particles to pass through it.
Wow.
So what's interesting about an HVAC system is if you have centralized air, you're going to have a coil that's going to constantly condensate. And so we just talked about moisture and water. Well, that's a constant source for moisture. So if mold passes through into the coil and has that opportunity to meet with the coil when it's condensating, you have an opportunity for mold to start to grow in the HVAC system. And then from there, it's very easy for it to just populate all throughout the house.
Sure.
So, it's really maintaining, I think water and humidity is huge. So if you live in a humid climate like me over in Florida, you're going to want to dehumidify the house to make sure that the house is always kept below 50%.
Okay.
After 50%, you get into that danger zone where it has an opportunity to start to grow.
Sure. You mentioned, I think you said there's 100+ million homes in the U.S.
Yeah.
How many you may or may not know the answer to this, but how many of those homes do you think have mold that are at a harmful level?
That's a good question. So the best answer I can give you on that is based on a study done in 1994 by John Spengler, which is the largest home survey ever done in this country. Actually, it was part of this country, and they did some of Canada too. And basically, they've identified that 50% of the homes had water damage.
Wow.
Now, does water damage always mean mold? No, because if it dries in as quickly as 48 hours, you're safe.
Okay.
If it takes longer than 48 hours, you're highly in the danger zone.
Right.
So, what I would say is out of those 50%, how many of those had mold? I think it's hard to say. I think their study said that 36% of all the homes they surveyed, which was 12,000 homes, had mold. Like
Wow.
they validated that had mold. So I don't know where the mathematics are on that exactly, but there's a good bit, of those probably 50% of homes did have mold. So it's definitely a scary study. I mean, a lot of homes in America have mold. Now, what's interesting is, and I'll have to send you these photos, but
please.
I'm building a house right now, brand new. It has mold everywhere, all over the framing.
Really?
So,
well, that's probably pretty common in new construction, right? Is that something that's pretty common?
Well, yeah, of course. But so imagine this. So let's say I tell you your home has mold right now. And you're like, you know what? Maybe it's, I don't know, $30,000 to repair it. And you're like, you know what? I didn't want to stay here that long anyway. I'm going to just disclose this. I'm going to list the house. I'm going to build a new house. Logically, we think like, oh, new house, no way it can have mold. It could have never been further from the truth. In fact, you're very likely to have mold because when they're building the frame of the house, all that wood framing is going to sit for 2 weeks. It takes an average of 2 weeks to frame a house out. So for 2 weeks, it's going to be exposed to the elements. Now, that's not the problem. The problem is that the builders aren't educated enough to know that, hey, when the house is done being framed and it's all enclosed, we should treat it for mold so that when we bring in insulation and drywall and we start putting those up, we wouldn't have any issues.
Right. Interesting.
But, I guess just it's a cheaper home if they don't deal with that. And when I met with my builder and showed him the problem, his response was, well, I don't really think that's such an issue because it's not producing in the air right now because all the moisture is going to be gone when it's built. I was like, well, but what happens if the humidity gets really high one day and let's say, God forbid, my AC shuts down, there's a power outage, right?
Yep.
Now you have all this mold that can become reactivated and start producing in the air again. It goes, oh, yeah. It's like, so are you suggesting we should just leave this all here? Well, no, we're going to treat it. We just don't want to really open up this can of worms where you have to start treating all of our homes. I'm like, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Right. That's the problem in many ways that you're trying to fix. It's caused by people that have that kind of mindset.
Yeah, it's all avoidable. And, just like biohacking, you could do something about it. We can do something about this. It just takes all of us becoming aware of it so that, think about it. Everything changes with demand. So if we all start saying like, okay, I'm going to build a new home. Hey, I want you to treat it before you put insulation and drywall in. Guess what? All builders are going to start treating their homes before they put insulation and drywall in because everyone wants that. Right. So we have to, educate to create that demand so that we can incite this change, right?
Right. So how do you go about educating people? Obviously, like your book is a good step in the right direction. Sure. Going on podcasts like this is a step in the right direction. But how do you go about educating people to make them aware of the issue and how it's a real concern, a health concern in their lives?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a full court press. So it's going on podcasts like this, right?
Yep.
It's writing books. So
Right.
I did one book which talks about how to be better at remediation for people who really need that.
Yep.
My next book is going to talk about how all these industries tie in together unknowingly and create this mold problem that we have, whether it's renovation contractors, builders, the real estate industry. There's so many different industries that tie into this. So I think that next book shining a light on those avenues that need to be changed will help as well. But I will tell you that the main thing that I do is I reach out to doctors. I reach out to naturopathic doctors, holistic, functional medicine.
Yep.
And the thing that we're trying to do is educate them. And some of them already know. Like as soon as I contact them, they're like, "Oh, I already know. This is amazing. Thank you for all you're doing. That's great." But there is a large percentage out there that's like, "Oh, no, it never really clicked for me that mold could be a problem."
Yeah.
And so now they're starting to recommend to their clients, "Hey, you should get a mold inspection done." It's like you have to really educate as many of the avenues you possibly can that actually have this communication line to the people that need it, right? And that's the key. So, doctors are a big thing, and I can tell you that this year we've seen more doctors than any year talk about mold. And that's a really good sign because
Definitely.
it's been such a slow moving target in trying to get the educational system handled.
Yep. No, that's a big step in the right direction. I know you talked about having a mold inspector come in and really just do like a deep dive into whether there's mold in your home or not. But are there certain things people can be doing, certain signs that we can be looking for if there's mold contamination in our homes?
Yeah, so you got two basic sensory that you can take a look at, sight and smell. So if you see like a brown circle developing on your drywall, that's a sign that there was either there's an ongoing leak or there was a leak at some point in time.
Okay.
And again, that brown circle doesn't mean you have mold, but it obviously is evidence of water damage. And depending on how fast it dried would determine if there's a likelihood for mold or not. So by looking at that, I would say, you know what? I would probably want to get a mold inspection at that point. The other thing to notice is that musty odor. I think we've all been in basements or in places where it just smelled very unusual.
Yep.
Get this musty odor. The science of that is the musty odor is actually what's called MVOCs. So the VOC is kind of like the best way to describe it is if you ever painted a wall and you get that like paint odor. So that odor is a volatile organic compound that's created by the paint. It's basically, as the paint's off-gassing, it creates these VOCs. Mold has a similar thing, whereas as it's basically just being produced and it's active, you're going to get a very strong musty odor that's coming off of the mold. So, to clarify, the musty odor doesn't always mean you have mold, but it means that you definitely have a damp environment where mold has the opportunity to grow. So you definitely want to get that corrected as soon as possible, because if you don't have mold already, you will shortly. Okay. And it also identifies if you do have mold, you'll still get that musty odor as well. So that would be a good sense of, hey, let me get a mold test done and see what's going on here.
Okay. Now I know we've talked about mold inspection and hiring a mold inspector. What can people be doing to best choose a mold remediation company?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. So I actually put on my website, there's like 11 different questions that you want to really ask. And it goes far beyond the are you licensed and insured, because I think that's the easiest question people always ask. But it's really just getting an understanding for, what they do and what their practices are. So a lot of the questions that I would ask are like, what type of engineering controls do you guys set up? And so for the layman's term, an engineering control means that they're setting up measures and precautions so that when they do remediation, it doesn't cross-contaminate from that area that has mold to an area that doesn't have mold. And so what you have to do is you have to create that one space under negative pressure and basically create the outside spaces under positive pressure so that you don't have this cross-reference of pressurization. And to give you a frame of reference, if you've ever opened the door to a building and like for some reason as you open the door, you have like a gush of wind coming at you and you're like, did I just step into a wind tunnel? That means that building is actually positively pressurized. So the air is flowing outwards as opposed to inwards. So the reason that you want a building positively pressurized is so that the outside environment can't penetrate into there. Because, mold lives in our ecosystem. So they don't want any outside contaminants. Like hospitals are a prime example of buildings that are always positively pressurized. They don't want any contaminants getting into that hospital. So that's what you want to really create inside your house. You want to create negative pressure in the area you're working in so that it's drawn out, outside, usually through a window, as opposed to going into other rooms. The other questions you want to ask is like, I have these 3 pillars, and to keep things really simple, it's remove the colonization of mold. So colonization would be a mold source that's actively growing. Mm-hmm. The second thing you want to do is you want to correct the water or moisture intrusion event that led to the opportunity for mold to grow in the first place. So if you have a window that's leaking, you need to repair that. Otherwise, you can remediate all you want. It's going to come back the next time it leaks. And the third thing, and the most important thing, I think, is cleaning up the contamination created by that mold. So you have a window leak, mold's growing in the wall cavity right below your window. It's actively producing mold spores. And if it's a mycotoxin producing species, it's actively producing mycotoxins. Mycotoxins just stand for fungal toxins. So it's toxins produced by certain species of mold. Finally, depending on where the source of the water came in, you could have bacteria present. And bacteria produces its own set of toxins. So you can do what's called an endotoxin test to see if that's occurring. And again, if you are doing a final cleanup and removing the contamination, you can remove mycotoxins, the mold spores themselves, endotoxins, etc., and make sure that the space is brought back truly to what it was before this whole thing happened. And I think that's, you'll hear a lot of slogans out there like it never happened. But the thing is, our whole industry, that's never been true because they've never cleaned up the contamination afterwards. Now think about it. I'm sure one of your listeners has been through a mold experience before where they had a company come in and make some repairs. Yep. They probably didn't even really know there was like this full remediation process. Now, ask yourself, did they ever go inside the HVAC unit, like recommend cleaning the HVAC unit? Did they even check to see if the HVAC unit was contaminated? Probably not. Because again, like our industry, they put the blinders on. They don't want you to know all this stuff. They just want to rip out the wall and call it a day. Spray some chemical, and that's mold remediation, That's the problem that with our industry that I'm trying to solve is like, hey, this is, we need to blow the lid off this thing. It's not okay,
Right. Yeah. So for everything that you just mentioned, would you say those are all things that you and your company are doing that a lot of the rest of the industry is not doing properly?
Yeah. So that's exactly right. I mean, basically that's the missing ingredients that I've seen that have worked for us. So the reason we've been able to help 500 families is because we've literally founded our whole operation on those 3 principles. Stop the source of mold growing, remove it, correct the water intrusion, and then clean up the contamination. And there's like literally no company. There's 50,000 mold remediation companies out there, and we're like one of the only ones, maybe 1% at most of companies are actually going that in depth or that.
That's
detailed.
Crazy.
It's crazy. It's a big problem.
Yeah. Part of what I'm about to ask is a question I like to save for the end, and it's like, who do you want to impact the most with your work? And we can still get to that question later on, but what I want to kind of cover in a little bit more detail is like the idea of impact and the work that you're doing. How do you go about really changing the whole industry and changing the things that you're seeing that are just wrong and not done the right way for decades? Are you going at it from an approach where if you start doing the right things and get other companies to come on board, you can kind of change the whole industry? Is that kind of the approach you're taking?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm actively working on now is creating my own certification. Now, the point of that is to be able to educate other business owners that really want to do this, that just maybe don't know how.
Sure.
And I think that certification process is going to be probably the next major thing that I'll roll out that would really help this kind of move faster on a bigger scale. Because like I said earlier, like me fixing one house at a time, no matter how many people I employ, no matter how big we get, is never going to cut it. There's 50,000 remediation companies. So it would take more than a lifetime to get to that size where I can service as many people as 50,000 remediation companies service. Yeah. So I realized quickly that, my dreams that I had maybe a decade ago of like, I want to be the biggest mold remediation company that does what we do and helps people who are individually sensitive. Sure. Those quickly, I realized as I got older that's not going to be the way to get there. Right. The way to get to where I really want to go is to help others, get on board with this mission. Yeah. So it's going to be certifying other companies to do exactly what we do, retrain them on the process so they can help their branch and network of people. And we just keep kind of going that way. So the book obviously dives into the steps that we take, but I think that if you are a remediator and you buy my book, I think you're going to have a good idea of the concepts you need to take forth for sure. But I think it's without having that like hands-on training, I don't know that it's going to be fully able to be duplicated. Right. And I realize that because words on a page are different than seeing something in person. So I think that the next thing I want to do is kind of roll out that training program and that certification to really help others. I think that's going to be a big thing. And also it helps internationally. So I don't know if you realize this, but there's like 0 standards internationally for mold, like at all. Wow. So they only use the IICRC S520, which is their industry standards really used for here, more for like water damage. They do have an S520 for mold remediation, but again, it's very slim pickings in terms of what you need to do. I think that creating this standard could help people internationally too, and I can help certify international companies who also, again, want to do the right thing, but just don't have the technology.
Yep. I like that approach. I mean, you can try to do it all on your own, or it's like the, teach a man to fish analogy. If you do the certification, the training, you're helping shift the industry in a positive direction. I wasn't aware about the international piece there. Is that something that's like always been that way, that there's not been any, like internationally, there's not been a whole lot of, what was the word you used? Help me out here.
Like there's no certification or standards or protocols,
standards,
right?
Standards, protocols.
Yeah, it's really rough. So I have a potential client that I'm working with. I say potential because as of right now, I'm just kind of giving them some advice and trying to help them. But basically she's sensitive to mold. She lives in the UK, beautiful home in the UK. In the UK, they build mostly with masonry products. Whereas here we build mostly with wood products. Yep. And she sent me tons and tons of photos of the property, and I'm like, okay, I figured this out. Here's what we need to do. And I'm like giving her all this advice, and she's like, well, I can't get any of those things. And I'm like, oh yeah, that could be a problem. Wow. So I'm like, well, we're gonna have to go old school. We're gonna have to use hydrogen peroxide. I started like spending the time to research what's available in the UK, and I stumbled upon, I started saying, well, like, who's the authority in the UK? So I started Googling, and it's, there's just like 0 authority. There's no like, we have the ACAC here, IICRC, we have state licenses, like there's nothing there, right? So just the IICRC standards that were created here in America, they pretty much have adopted, not even as a legal response, but just companies that want to do the right thing. They just have adopted those regulations as really the only sets of regulations that they have. Wow. And so it's very interesting. I had an opportunity to review her mold report, which looked very different than our mold reports here. And basically all he had was like, I'm an IICRC, member, and he had all these steps you needed to take. And honestly, they don't have like a very good range of products that you can use. Like for us, we use all botanical and non-toxic products. Okay. And you can't for some reason, I guess they haven't approved these products to get distributed there or whatever it have you. And a lot of their products that they have, from what I was researching, is basically almost non-existent in terms of anything comparable. So they have some like sealers, but nothing that has like antimicrobial. So when I'm like, hey, we need an antimicrobial, semi-permeable based product to put on the cement block walls, it's like that doesn't exist there. Wow. So it's definitely got its own set of challenges. I think that really what happened was, I don't think that they've ever really thought that mold was a problem. Right. And I think a lot of what we're seeing here is like, we can't really pinpoint is mold becoming a bigger problem today than it ever was, or are we just becoming more aware of it? Right. You know, and that's what we're trying to figure out. And I think it's probably a little bit of both. Yep. But I don't know how that affects, you know, things abroad, other than the fact that there's really no standards, and they may have never thought that they really needed one. You know? Yeah.
Either way, whether it's more of a problem now than before, or we're just becoming more aware of it, I think from what I'm hearing and the research I've been doing, it seems like there's just a ton of opportunity in your field to make drastic advancements. And obviously that's what you're trying to do. So that's great.
Yes, exactly.
Very cool. How about someone like myself who I may or may not have mold contamination in my home? I don't have any signs that I can tell. But I am in an apartment building I don't know exactly when this was built, but my guess would be at least 4 or 5 decades ago. There's a possibility that I do have mold, but it's not necessarily something that I see, or like it's not visible. It's not something that I've had issues with in terms of my health. So I guess what I'm getting at is, like, since it's not super prominent in my life, I'm not always worrying about it, or, sure. I'm simply not worried about it until I necessarily have to be. Sure. So can you tell us a little bit more about, like, what are some major health concerns that you're seeing with people that have mold contamination in their homes? You know, what is it that we should be actually concerned about?
Good. Well, basically I can tell you that most of the symptoms that people are experiencing are, upper respiratory. For me, I have like an acute sensitivity to aspergillus specifically. Mm-hmm. So if I go to a hotel or something and there's aspergillus, it's like within about, I don't know, a minute of me entering the room, it almost feels like I immediately got a cold. Like, it's the craziest thing.
That's wild.
And my nose starts running. I'm sneezing. Sometimes I get like itchy in my, around my face. Sometimes my eyes are burning or like perpetually itchy. It feels very, very weird. What's even more interesting is about 5 minutes after I leave that environment, it's like it never happened.
That's crazy.
It's very, and that's what I imagine that, certain people feel when they're acutely sensitive. Yep. When you're chronically sensitive, it's a whole different ballgame. I mean, you can go into a moldy environment and like it might take you 3 days, 4 days, sometimes even a week to really get out of that funk. And some of those symptoms can be like brain fog, chronic fatigue. Yep. Definitely your upper respiratory symptoms. But then you have, mycotoxins, which I think are the biggest concern from a health perspective when it comes to making sure that you have a really good environment. You want to make sure it's mycotoxin free. That's where it starts to get a little scary, because a lot of research points to mycotoxins being carcinogenic, having a lot of, cancer related issues, deterioration of tissues, muscles, bones, etc. Those are where things get scary. Obviously, we don't know the thresholds. Yeah. For a lot of those symptoms, it could be a very high amount of mycotoxins that's present inside the body. But the thing to be concerned about is if you're sensitive, the biggest issue you have is your body's not detoxifying these things from your body. And so if you are in a moldy environment that has mycotoxins and a ton of contamination present, then your body is not removing it, and you're just basically, it just keeps compounding inside your body as you're constantly exposed. So it's just getting in faster than it's coming out. Yeah. And I think that's where you start to see like things get really, really much worse.
Mm-hmm.
Mold is not going to be as scary for some people as it is for others. And I think that as a society, we have to be cognizant of that and be, kind of supportive of that it may totally impact one person drastically different than it does another.
Right.
So, if someone in your family starts complaining and, mold is what is thought to be the culprit,
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely listen to them because I think that's one of the biggest familial challenges that I always see on a daily basis is, because 1 out of 4 people are going to be sensitive. That means that when one person's not feeling well in your family and they think it's mold and the doctor thinks it's mold and the hygienist thinks it's mold, but you're like, but I feel fine. You got to take that as an understanding of like, okay, I feel fine. I'm lucky that, my immune system's really strong. I don't have these issues, that I'm able to detoxify this and, not rush to judgment that the other person is crazy or it's all in their head. Because, for me, I've seen, over 500 families go through this exact scenario. And then after remediation, they actually start to heal. And it's like, wow, so you weren't crazy after all. And we could just skip a few steps, like just, do some research out there. You'll understand that this is a real thing. And it impacts people vastly different.
Sure.
Every single time. It's a very individualized thing. So
definitely. How can people get healthy again after remediation? Is it something as simple as like once the process is done, it's just going to kind of naturally happen? Or are there certain things people can do to get healthy quicker?
Well, it will naturally happen, obviously, because you're not constantly re-exposed. I think that's the biggest issue because there are things you can take, there's binders, there's antifungals, there's a lot of anti-inflammatory supplements, things that can really help heal the body. I know there's tons of doctors all over the country. So no matter where you are, if you type in, holistic doctor, functional medicine doctor, naturopathic doctor, you research who's in your area, you call them and ask them if they have success treating mold. I think that you'll definitely find someone that you can connect with. But the reality of it is, if you just do that part, and believe me, I've had clients that were like, fixing this house is far too expensive to confront right now. I'm just going to go to the doctor. You'll start to feel better on that side too, but then you hit a plateau.
Right.
You can't get 100% until you really do both. Now, I recommend always seeing a doctor and getting on some sort of program. It's very similar to biohacking, right? You have imbalances going on. You have, poor detoxification going on. You need to kind of correct that. I think that if you do that, you're going to definitely start to heal faster than if you just were to let it, happen naturally.
Sure. Got it. That's good to know. Very cool. How about your book, Mold Medic? What else have we not discussed that you want to talk about? Some key takeaways from your book.
So, that book was written for people who really are sensitive, I think. And if you're sensitive and you're like, you know what, I know I have been impacted by mold. I really don't feel well. I don't necessarily know where it is, but I know it's here.
Sure.
And I've been through a few inspectors. Maybe you've even been through remediation before, and you're like, I just can't seem to get over mold. That book is going to help you, for sure, because it really outlines like how to find a good mold inspector, what are the types of questions you need to ask. Same thing on remediation. I have a doctor that helped me write one of the chapters that actually talk about the body and how mold can impact the body and what to do if you have mold toxicity inside your body. And then it starts talking about like, well, how do I improve my home overall, from a construction standpoint so that I don't have this reoccurring issue. What do I do with my HVAC system? What about all my stuff that could be potentially contaminated?
Yeah.
I've been in places where it was so bad, there was mushrooms growing on the wall. I kid you not. And it was like, this person was like, well, what do I do with my stuff? And I'm like, man, please throw it all away.
Yeah.
That's bad.
Yeah.
And so you gotta really know like what's the best bang for the buck on how to deal with your stuff, depending on how bad the home really was.
Yep.
And all of that stuff is outlined on there because it's really just never been done before on how to really deal with something from a mold expert's point of view, is actually who physically does the remediation perspective. Yep. So I think I think that book would do wonders. Now, if you are not sensitive to mold and you read the book, I think it's going to give you some really good information on how mold remediation should be, so that, because look, we don't know the long-term effects mold exposure has on someone who's healthy. We don't know if it makes them sensitive over time, right? So I think if you're really healthy, you have mold and you're like, you know what, I want better air quality. That's my 2021, my change there, my resolution. So it'll really outline the steps of how to do it properly, because there's so many snake oil salesmen in this business that are like, we'll just fog it for $1,500, and we'll wipe it down and call it a day. And obviously the problem with that is mold has roots that grow into building materials. So when you just wipe away what's on the surface, the roots are still there. It's kind of like just like removing a weed by cutting the stem. Right. It's just going to grow back, right? So, there's a lot of processes out there that seem financially, achievable and attractive. But remember, there's 3 pillars, right? It's remove the colonization, remove the source that created the colonization in the first place, and then clean up the contamination. So the fogging process will clean up the contamination, right? Yeah. But does it correct the water intrusion? I didn't hear anything about ripping anything out and fixing anything. And does it actually remove the colony if the roots are still there and they're going to grow back? No, it doesn't. So like that's what I'm saying. These are the things you have to worry about. I think if you own a home, buy the book, because 1 out of every 10 years is the statistic based upon the insurance industry. 1 out of every 10 years, we're going to have a water damage event. So it's a good book to equip you with the knowledge of, if I ever have mold, I want to make sure it's done right. I want to protect my family. I'm going to, have the knowledge now to make sure that when I need remediation, I'm well equipped. Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to the education piece, and I really see it like there's different tiers of people and how mold affects us. There's obviously people that are hypersensitive to mold. But then there's people like myself where I feel very healthy and strong immune system. And from my knowledge, I don't have a high sensitivity to mold, but it's still something that can affect my life and something that I want to learn more about and learn how I can prevent it. And if I do have a home one day that I end up getting mold, I want to know the right steps to take. Yeah. Definitely. So kudos to you, man. I think you're doing really good work here.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, before I get to my last few questions, I do want to kind of pivot a bit. We were talking about Dave Asprey before our call here. Yeah. Do you drink coffee, by the way?
I do.
Okay, so he's big into, I don't know if he was one of the first guys to start talking about it, but mold toxins in our coffee beans. Yes. And I remember reading his book. It was the Bulletproof book. I can't remember the title. And he was talking quite a bit about mold toxins in coffee beans. Are you aware of this at all? Do you have any insight on that?
So first off, I drink Bulletproof coffee.
Yeah, I do too.
So there's a couple other good companies out there, but the first horse to the race usually is the best branded. Yep. And I just really like the taste of his coffee. I've tried some of the other brands, just as great in terms of quality, but I just ended up starting to like the taste, and maybe that's just branding at work or what have you. But here's the thing: coffee beans are some of the most toxic things that we put into our body, and it's not the coffee itself; it's how the coffee is made. So you have heavy amounts of pesticides that are applied to coffee beans. Then they're stored in these dark, humid containers. Yep. Think Costa Rica, for instance. Yeah. And they're in a moldy environment, right? So the mold starts growing in these canisters. It starts getting all over the coffee beans. And so what he's talking about, mycotoxins, I kind of touched on this earlier. Yeah. Mycotoxins are toxins produced by certain species of mold. And these species of mold, whenever they feel threatened, will produce mycotoxins. It's their way of reproducing, kind of kill the predator, right? And what's interesting is we know very little about what causes mold to feel threatened, other than, we know there's some release when remediation is being performed. That's why it's so important to clean up the contamination after. There's a lot of studies going on that Wi-Fi can speed up it can make mold feel threatened, speed up the production of mold spores, the reproduction. And then, potentially mycotoxins. It's again, we don't know the exact science of what causes it. We just know that it does happen, and it's something to be cautious of. So the fact that Dave Asprey and a couple other companies are following suit, test their coffee for mycotoxin presence, really make sure and do this quality control, I think is so huge, because that can really help change the landscape for, coffee enthusiasts who, I have clients all the time that are like, I love coffee, but ever since mold, I can't drink it, and potentially if they tried, some of these brands like Bulletproof, they'd actually probably be able to consume them and not have this issue. Obviously there can be issues with caffeine, certain individuals and caffeine don't mix well, but for the most part, I think that, mold and mycotoxins with the coffee industry are the biggest problems. So awesome to Dave Asprey. Hope he watches this. And,
man. I remember reading
love what he's doing.
Yeah, he's doing great work, and like you said, there's a few others. I like Keon Coffee as well. They do clean coffee, detect for mycotoxins. I remember reading Dave Asprey's book. This was like 5 or 6 years ago, and it's the first time I came across the term mycotoxins and anyone even talking about it in our coffee. And I don't want to quote me on this because I got to go back and double check, but I'm pretty sure he said like majority of coffee that you have, your Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks, even, coffee you buy at the store, they're likely going to have mold toxins. And that's when I was like, oh God, I got to change up the coffee I'm drinking here because that's pretty gross. Cool.
And maybe that's why we're getting more sensitive, because I think as years go on, we just drink more coffee, we work longer, we drink more coffee. I mean, who knows? I mean, there's probably a lot that goes into that, but I wholeheartly agree with him, because it makes so much sense. The other big industry that we don't think about is wine. Yeah. If you've ever had a chance to travel and you go and look at these wineries and you go into these 100-year-old wine cellars, they're riddled with mold. The barrels that they store the wine in for the aging process is riddled with mold. So like, that's another big thing. There's a wine group that I'm part of that does mycotoxin testing on the wine. And make sure that they don't have any added sugar, because for me, sugar is like poison. I try to stay away from sugar as much as possible. And I think that that's another like industry to look out for. We drink we drink wine a lot, right? I mean, look, it's definitely part of our world. It's part of our ecosystem. I think when you're sensitive, you have to really start to think about this and really start to adapt. But when we're talking about, clean air, clean water, clean environment, these are things that we have to really pay attention to. I've talked to people in other industries where it's not necessarily mold, but there's other things that we do as a society that has the potential to make us sick. Did you know that the average human, I think consumes about 10 credit cards a month in plastic?
Yeah. Somebody was just telling me that. Somebody commented that in my YouTube, one of my videos, that like in the comments, they're like, did you know we consume, I think they said one, it's probably a little bit more, but they said 1 credit card worth of plastic per week. So that's pretty close. Okay, you said about 10 per month?
Yeah, 10 per month. I mean,
it's about 1 or 2 a week.
I guess that number needs to be nailed down a bit, but even
still, it's still outrageous.
If you take out a credit card and look at it, you're like, wait a second. So I eat this every month. It's interesting. Like I feel like as a society, we're just like so tricked with like these marketing gimmicks. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like that we're like, everything that's printed on a label, we believe it. BPA free. And we're like, okay, great. We got rid of BPA. Well, BPA probably has a cousin that's also not good that they just started producing on that instead, And so like, we have to really educate ourselves as much as we can on anything that involves our health. And I think that for me, and what I notice, mold seems to be like the biggest thing that I see that people don't realize. Because I think we do a pretty good job with the food industry. Like, let's eat organic, let's eat healthier. You have guys like Dave Asprey that are at the forefront, Mark Hyman. There's all these people that are really talking about that from a health perspective. That's awesome. And I feel like now we needed, a mold voice, and I'm hoping that I can step up and fill that role.
Definitely, man. I think, like I alluded to earlier, I think there's a huge opportunity in this space. and you're doing great work. Before I forget, do you mind sharing? Because I do like wine. You were talking about that wine group
Yes.
that does testing
Yes.
for mycotoxins. Can you share that?
Yes. It's Dry Farm Wines.
Dry Farm Wines. Cool. I'll be
Yeah.
Googling that once we hang up here.
Yeah. I think I get like 6 bottles of wine. You could do like all red or all white or
Cool.
mixed. And they'll send you like 6 bottles, I think is the minimum, and 12 if you want to buy all in one bulk. But you can set it for like once a month, once every other month, once every 3 months, whatever you want. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And there's been times where I've had where I'm like, man, I still didn't even open the last box.
Right.
And they're like ready to send me another shipment, and I just push it back, and
Yep.
they're like totally cool with that. So I love that service because, yeah, I mean, wine is nice to be able to drink, especially if it's mycotoxin free. You have a social event, you bring a bottle of wine. It's just like the thing to do. So I think that making sure that it doesn't have mycotoxins and potential mold contamination is huge.
I didn't even think of that, honestly, before you mentioned the wine industry, how much it's affected by mold. And it makes sense. You said, the aging process, the barrels, the wine cellars. Yeah. Makes sense.
Well, there's continuous moisture in the barrels that are being stored.
Yep.
And it's a perfect opportunity for mold to grow. So it's
100%.
Another thing that just like coffee is not even really thought about.
For sure. Before I get to my last question, where can people find out more about you and the work you're doing and your company?
Yeah, so a couple of different places. TheMoldMedic.com is kind of like the landing page to go over my book.
Cool.
Where to buy it, things like that. It also is going to talk more about me as a person. AllAmericanRestoration.com is the service-based business. So if you have mold and you're like, I want the best company out there, that would be your resource to go to. To contact me personally, the best way is Michael@AllAmericanRestoration.com. And so, I don't charge for consultations or anything. It's just something that I do for free. So if you ever just wanted to talk to me or pick my brain, send me an email. We'll figure out a time and a good time to talk. And then I usually just set up like a free 30-minute call just to help any way I possibly can.
That's awesome. That's super cool. And I'll have all of that linked up in the show notes in the description of the video as well. So
awesome.
Cool, man. The last question I have for you, and I know we've talked a little bit about impact and where you kind of want to take this whole thing and want to steer the direction of the industry. But who is it that you really want to impact with the work that you're doing?
Americans, or potentially even the world population. I mean, I want to protect the consumer, right? I'm a consumer. You're a consumer. We're everyday people, and I've seen so many people get messed up from this, whether it's the insurance company, just recommended somebody to benefit them instead of benefit the client, whether people just didn't know better. They had a leak, they thought it was fine, they thought it was fixed, and it got worse over time. I want to educate people so that we can all live better lives and not have mold be this big problem that it is today. Yeah. And whatever I can do to help, for me as a person, I saw, just based upon the expertise I had, and I saw this problem that existed that it didn't seem like anyone was actually trying to solve. And the fact that, I now kind of have this voice and I'm helping people, to me, that's awesome. I hope to be able to sell my service-based business one day because we don't even need it, or close it down entirely because everyone's kind of on the up and up. I think that would be like a dream come true. And then I would be like, okay, what's the next problem to solve? And I'll start there. That's the thing. So I'm really excited to get out there and make a difference and help as many people as I can through education, through the service if they really need it. And, hopefully we can inspire some change so that others can join the same fight we're fighting.
Yes. That's awesome, man. I love that. Yeah. Very cool. Keep up your good work. You're really doing good things for the industry. So appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Thanks, Michael.